Cool. Okay. So, firstly, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for the organisers for inviting me and Phil to talk to you all today. So, today we're going to be talking about a really cool steelyard weight, which you can see spinning around in front of you on your screens, hopefully, and also what we think is a settlement site that it's come from, found in Oxfordshire. So, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to start with the exciting thing, which really is a spectacular steelyard weight. So this was found by two metal detectorists, Craig Edwards and Stephen Clark, not in September 2021 as I wrote there, but September 2020, who brought it to me when we were able to take fines in September and October of last year. You remember there's a little time where we weren't locked down, so I was able to have in-person fines meetings. So this object, along with a large Roman assemblage of other artifacts collected during that summer, were brought to me by the two metal detectorists to be fully recorded. It meant that I actually had access to the objects in hand. I was able to study them over a large period of time, which allowed us to get some far more high resolution IDs than we might otherwise have done if they just sent us pictures. Now, just to discuss the steelyard weight in a little bit more detail, it's clearly in the form of a Roman bust. When I talk about busts, it is missing its shoulders. You can see on one corner how we've got the beginning of them, but on the left-hand side, it's missing them, and that's down to damage. In terms of the way the loop's attached, there's a little sort of rectangular slot cut into the top of the head, and then that's been slotted into what is essentially a hollow copper alloy bust, which has then been filled with lead, giving it quite a lot of weight. It's not very large, it would fit in the palm of your hand, but it's got a lot of weight due to that lead content. Now, in terms of the design itself, we think it's in the form of the head of the god of Jupiter, god Jupiter. Now, we came to that conclusion not through any sort of expertise on my part, because actually my specialty is more the Bronze Age of Britain, but actually through help through Phil, who's going to be talking to you in a little bit, and also Sally. And I think this emphasizes one of the really powerful things about the Portable Antiquities scheme. It's not just isolated flows which just deal with certain areas and regions. We're a whole network of specialists, all of our independent sort of areas of research specialty, connected to a large group of finds advisors who can access to get better identification of these objects. So very lucky, we've got a next door flow to mine, Phil, Berkshire's flow, has done a whole thesis on these objects. So I wanted to get him involved, and he was able to help, as well as Sally, find this really good parallel found from Venta Bulgarum. It's pretty similar in style in terms of the way the head is shaped, the way the hair is placed on that, so we think it's quite strong. And because it's quite a well-textured object, I was able to experiment in my free time creating a 3D model of this object, which has allowed us to do some quite cool things. So after this whole presentation and after all the talks, I'd recommend checking out the record, because by going on that 3D model on the PAS database, you can start to see all the fine little details of the object in a lot more detail and do some quite cool things, which we'll show later. So I'm not going to talk about steelyard weights anymore. That's going to be Phil's job, because he knows all about it far more than I do. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the context of the weight. So this was found in West Oxfordshire, which is a very rural area. We've got lots of small rivers, often tributaries of the Thames flowing in this sort of region. But it's in a region of West Oxfordshire, which, while west of a relatively large site called Gill Mill, doesn't have really much established Roman settlement known to the archaeological record through the HER, for example. About 1.5 kilometres south of where it was found, there was a corn dryer found through some developer-funded slot trenches, but actually the evidence was pretty sparse. There wasn't really all that much. And that really is all we got in the area, barring a few crop marks which have yet to be determined what they represent. So it's in an area south of the Roman road from Alcester, so we do have Roman activity in sort of the region, but no interesting settlements. So we wanted to know, well, what does this steelyard weight come from? And the answer is that weight on its own can't just do that. You need a full assemblage, and that's what I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So we had loads of Roman coins come from this site. There were a couple of Iron Age ones, but not really all that many. You can see one example in the top left of the screen, in fact, two there. But most of them were Roman coins. And all of those have identifications. Most of them I've been able to pin to a Reese period, and lots of them we've also got RIC numbers for. Now, when you plot these based on those famous Reese periods, what you can see is that the finds profile we get from the whole field around that site is pretty typical of what you'd see, not just in Oxfordshire, but also broadly the PAS. That we've got a large bump of coins in sort of the late 3rd and 4th century, and a few earlier periods before that. So that doesn't mean that it was only occupied in the 4th century. It's just kind of what we'd expect from a metal detected sort of range of artifacts. But we do have earlier artifacts as well, which we're going to show on the next slide. And these are lots of brooches. I've got 8 brooches on this slide, and what you'll see is that these date mostly to sort of the early, well, really late 1st century and early 2nd century. There's a couple more brooches which have since been found by Stephen Cray from that area, but they don't really change its profile all too much. Now, in terms of the size of the assemblage of brooches, it's not enough for us to provide a sort of re-evaluation of Oxfordshire's brooches or anything along those lines. But what we can do is compare that to lots of other settlements found in Oxfordshire, for example, which are listed on the Roman Rural Settlement Project, and see if they're similar or different. And what we find is actually the profile, the actual types of brooches are very consistent. What we see are generally villa sites or smaller, sort of less developed but still well occupied farming sites. We've also had other artifacts, which I've listed on the next slide, which include lots of cool artifacts, I think, which include bracelets. We've got toilet articles, we've got a pelter-shaped mount there, we've got possibly a spoon handle, and a couple of other artifacts as well. So when we bring all these artifacts together, I think we can start to make an argument for it's not just, for example, a hoard site, like we saw in an amazing presentation just before, but probably something more to do with settlement. It's probably fairly well developed because we've got really quite a wide range of assemblage. We've got a well-established coin assemblage. We've got all those brooches you see before. So it's probably occupied throughout the Roman period. But it's not been enough, for example, to leave anything along the lines of very serious crop marks in the area, which have showed up sort of in the hinterland. So it's probably a site that needs more investigation. It's been reported to the Historic Environment Record, so they've got that there. And it's one which we wouldn't have known about if it weren't for metal detecting, which I think is a really important thing to highlight. So that's all the context of the site. But obviously, you know, we wanted to do this presentation because of that fantastic steelyard weight, and it felt it wouldn't be appropriate not to give them their due. So that's what Phil's going to tell us all about now.
So yeah, I'm just going to do a little bit of background on the steelyard weights, and then move on to the Jupiter one and a few others in particular. So steelyards, the history goes all the way back to 7th and 6th century BC, India and China, made their way to the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC through Greece. They're also mentioned in some ancient Greek plays. And the most typical ones we get in Britain are the one on the right here, the steelyard with 2 separate weights, and I'll come on to a bit more about that. But the Jupiter one would have probably been associated more with something like the one on the left on the continent. But what types of steelyards I've got in my thesis they are associated with in Britain is a little unclear. Going through the anatomy of the steelyard and these typical ones for Britain and the Northwest provinces, you have the typical steelyard arm with several loops hanging from it, so it can be turned over, and different weights, different masses measured all the way along, often on something like this one going up to 30 Roman pounds, which is quite a weight for a little device like this. Typically, these ones have a sliding weight that indicates the measurement, indicates the mass of the object to be weighed. They have a couple of suspension hooks. What I call the load instruments, which is a combination of chains, hooks, and this counterweight here, which is very typical for this type of balance. To show the difference between these, the sliding weight has 1 loop in one apex of the weight. The counterweight has loops at either apex. So when these are being recorded, that's an important thing to note, simply because we know where on the balance they would have come from. Now, this is why I'm going a bit quick through these, because I want to go back onto a bit more detail about steelyard weights in particular. When recording them, please weigh them. Even if they're fragmentary, even if you see they're not complete, please weigh them. The amount of mostly old reports I've been through where the mass isn't recorded, and the clue is in the name, it's the most important part of these. And the reason I say that is because a study of weights from Pompeii showed that they do tend to correlate with half or whole divisions of the Roman pound. So there is a reason for indicating their mass. There is, unlike it says in the Roman Inscriptions of Britain volume on these, that the mass doesn't matter for steelyard weights. It actually does. So the ones I showed on the previous slide, the sliding weight weighs 77.8 grams, which is 2.83 uncia. And if I just pop back to it, given the amount of wear and that it's likely also lost an iron coating, that tends to be 4.5 grams underweight for 3 uncia, so 94% of the original mass. It would have probably been a little over this to act against the counterweight, but it does matter that it was of this weight. So dividing it up, it's an uncia of 25.9 grams, which is slightly under the average of 27.45. It's pretty much accepted. So going on to the Jupiter weight very quickly, it's 455 grams, so 16.57 uncia. This one was a bit trickier as it's 3.5% overweight in mass for a 16 uncia weight, or a similar percentage underweight for 17 uncia. My feeling is that with the amount of the shoulders missing, it could have been closer to 18, which would make more sense because it would be even divisions of 6, so 12 ounces in the Roman pound. So then it would have been 1.5 pounds in weight. So it makes it an 8% difference, or 39.1 grams underweight for an 18 uncia weight. However, the higher you get, the more divisions you find within the mass, the more inaccurate these things tend to get because they were working to a higher specification. Thanks to Ed's 3D scanning, and now he has one of these, but I have a 3D printer at home. I was able to do a 3D print of this, printed it up and filled it with grains of rice to bring it up to weight of 1 Roman uncia, so 1 Roman ounce. And then I printed off a very basic steelyard arm and a few light hooks and used a bit of wire. So it worked as a piece of apparatus I can use in outreach projects. But when you print this out, you can do it to higher or lower spec and resolution. This one I did to a mid-range one, so you can still see some of the lines from the printing, but it comes out quite detailed. You can still see some of the detail in the cap and the hair, and even in the face there's a good amount there, but it does take quite a few hours to do. And just to finish off, coincidentally, I had this funny little steelyard weight come into me, found in Berkshire recently. It's very unclear from the photograph. I need to try and find a better way of lighting it, but there is a second face on this side. As many people will know, 2 faces opposing would indicate Janus, but it really doesn't look like the head of a god. Martin Hennig suggested the larger face is one of a dwarf, but something interesting on these weights and something I explored in my thesis was their apotropaic power, their metaphysical powers that protected the seller and the buyer in the transactions. So the use of, say, the Jupiter steelyard weight might be that the seller is invoking the god to show how trustworthy he is, how accurate his weights are, that they are guaranteed by the gods. The idea of a double head weight is that the buyer and seller are both protected and both being watched in the transaction for their honesty. The eyes of the steelyard weight are always on one of them. So there's some interesting, again, apotropaic powers associated with these. So yeah, that's a very brief overview of steelyard weights. If anyone's interested, I do have a PDF of my thesis on them and what ones are found in Britain and elsewhere. But yeah, thanks for listening to me and Ed.